Hello, everyone. This is your lovely Vice President, Edward Tahmizian. You all know me for my paper on the origin of evil and theistic art determinism. And today, for the fifth time, I'm going to be interviewing the great and legendary king of all Christ myth theorists, Dr. Richard Carrier. And we have a good selection of questions for today, so we'll begin with those.
Okay. Yeah.
Alrighty.
Hello.
Yeah,
Glad to be
hello,
back
hello.
on.
I
Let's
know,
see what we've got.
it's always a pleasure. Alrighty. Going into our first question. What genre would you classify Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John? And what dates would you give them and why?
Yeah, it's mythic biography, right? So I have an article on this called Adventures at the Society of Biblical Literature Conference, Part Two, where I talk about the Burridge studies. So there's Burridge is this famous, you know, analyst, literary scholar who studied the Bible long ago and concluded that the Gospels fit the genre of biography. Now, this was misused by Christian apologists who didn't read the rest of the sentence, the rest of what Burridge said. And then later, like the new edition of Burridge's book has this clarification is like, no, we mean mythic biography. It's not, it doesn't resemble historical biographies at all, really. Well, what it looks like is myth. But myth is a meta genre. It is not a specific genre. Myth can be written in all genres. So you can have myth written as history, you can have myth written as biography, you can have myth written as poetry, you can have myth written as a fable, you can have myth written as a novel, and so there's all these different literary genres that myth can be represented in. Burridge's conclusion, and several other scholars have come to the same conclusion, and I talk about that in that conference talk, because I actually went to the Society of Biblical Literature conference and sat in on a conference meeting of Burridge and several other scholars discussing the state of his thing, and they were all making the same point: is like it's been misinterpreted. We did not conclude that it was biography in the sort of historical sense. No, it's mythic biography, and you have to compare it to things like the lives of Aesop, so which are totally mythical biography of a non-existent person. And the lives of Aesop are similar to the Gospels in that they're anonymous, and that there are several versions. So, like, you have the original version, like the equivalent of Mark, and then you have someone borrowed it almost all the text verbatim and then changed and added some things. That's the equivalent of Matthew, and then you have like another one. So you have like multiple redactions of the same life, where anonymous people just keep editing the text the way they want. And so it's very similar to the Synoptic Gospels in that way. And it's, the Gospels are closer to that genre, if you want to call it a micro genre or whatever. So that's how you would classify the Gospels today. The thing about dating, that's much debated, of course, but the mainstream consensus is correct that the earliest that any gospel could have been written that we have is the 70s AD. That's where I personally would put the Gospel of Mark as towards the end of the 70s, maybe early 80s. Some scholars, like serious scholars, in fact, there's a growing trend to put it after 100. To actually, all the Gospels come in the second century. There have been several books that come out. Vincent and Trobisch and these other scholars are arguing for a later date. Even M. David Litwa now, just recently, is teaching a course where he's pushing the idea that the Gospels are all the second century contrivance. And that's possible. We don't have any evidence that can rule that out. I lean slightly towards Mark being late 70s, early 80s, because Mark seems to be responding to the original Jewish war, not the second Jewish war, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Hmm.
The Bar Kokhba revolt, like for Mark to be written after that, the way it's written doesn't make any sense to me. So it makes more sense as like responding to the Jewish war, and you're not going to do that like a whole generation later when everybody is, doesn't care anymore, right? So he's responding to something recent, and he uses there's a material that he uses regarding Jesus ben Ananias, this sort of other tale, this urban legend that we find in the Jewish War of Josephus. But there's nothing in Mark that uses material from the Jewish antiquities of Josephus. So it does suggest that Mark has written some before the Jewish antiquities. It doesn't prove it. Mark could have written after and just not cared about the Jewish antiquities and not used it, right? So he could totally have written in the second century. That's entirely possible. But I just think like the convergence of evidence pushes to late 70s, early 80s. And then, of course, everything else comes after, right? Because Matthew copies Mark, so we know he came later. Luke copies Matthew and Mark, so we know he came later. And John rewrites those guys, so we know he comes after Luke. So, and on top of that, our John is a third redaction. It's a second redaction of an original that we don't have. So there was the original John, which we don't have, and then there's someone came along and rewrote it, added things, moved things around, changed them. And then another person came along and added things and subtracted things and moved things around and changed them. And that's the version we have. So we don't even have the second redaction. We don't have the original. We only have the final redaction. And you can look at this in all the leading scholars who analyze the Gospel of John, who are experts in that gospel. They all talk about this 3-level. Some say 2-level, but I think the consensus now is that there had to be 3 levels. I think it's possible there were 2. Like I'm not going to rule out that possibility, but the general idea is that there were at least 3, or at least 2, and maybe 3 versions of John, and we only have the last one. And that one definitely has to be second century. There's no way it could be earlier because it had to undergo all those changes, right, over decades. And John has to be written after Luke and so on. So, and because that's also the original text definitely riffed on Luke. So we know the original John came after Luke. And so that's some of the reasons why we date the Gospels as we do. And the general date is 70s to maybe 130s is like the date range for all the Gospels, and scholars might dispute like where the ends are in those margins. But
All right, sounds good. Alrighty, going into our second question. Is the Gospel according to Luke historically reliable? I remember you claiming in rebuttal to James P. Holding that Luke, was a good historian, but not a critical one like Suetonius, and how he handled the conflicting accounts surrounding the birth of Caligula. Yeah, that was an interesting take where you gave the very great description of how, Suetonius, handles all these conflicting accounts. It said like something like, Pliny the Elder, younger, said something else, and someone else said something else, and then, Suetonius
yeah, for
narrows down on
people who are
how to
interested in
give the
that, in
answers. Yeah.
right, and what you're talking about, that's in Not the Impossible Faith, my book, Not the Impossible Faith, chapter 7, and I have this whole analysis showing how Suetonius handles sources versus how Luke handles sources, which is dodgier. Now, I don't remember saying that Luke necessarily was a good historian. He's definitely pretending to be a historian. That's not the same thing as being good at it. In fact, Luke is actually kind of bad at it. And I have a new article and up lately, which is how we know. I think it's how we know Acts. Let's see, yeah, how we know Acts is a fake history. So you can go to my website, richardcarrier.info, search for how we know Acts is a fake history, and get my take on that. And then the significance of that is that what I show in there, and what I show is actually what is in the mainstream scholarship, including leading commentaries on Luke and Acts and so on. So I'm not even out on a limb here. I'm just basically echoing the consensus, the secular consensus on these books, which is that they are fiction. They're a fiction dressed up to look like history. And they're done in the same way that like detective novels in the early 20th century would be done, right? So like you would have a historian, you'd have a writer who's doing history in the sense that he wants to color his story with historically accurate context, like the correct name of a president, the correct geography of New York, things like that. But the rest is all baloney, right? So it's all a fiction set inside this model. But Luke is doing it for propaganda purposes, so he's actually rewriting history. He's changing history and selling that as the correct history, even though it's false. And that's very similar to like the way Christians try to rewrite the history of the United States. So like the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and the founding fathers were all evangelical Christians who founded this as a Christian country. Like it's all myth, and you go and look and find out the truth is completely different than what they're saying. But they rewrite history to sell it as history. So it's fiction sold as history. And that's what Luke is doing with this. We can show from the letters of Paul that what actually happened is completely different from what Luke and Acts shows. So in Acts, for instance, Luke just changes almost every significant thing that is documented by Paul. And the timelines change. Who had which ideas has changed. What people thought about those ideas has changed. It's basically just he's completely altered the history to sell his own version of what he wants you to believe happened. It's not any attempt at all to research what actually happened. Luke as an author is uninterested in what actually happened. He's only interested in what he wants you to believe happened. And so in that sense, he's a propagandist and a fiction writer, but he's posing as a historian. And so that's the way to understand Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the Book of Acts, which come together as a 2-volume set, really.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting how you pointed out that in order for Luke to have been a critical historian like Suetonius, he couldn't have just said, like, he got information from Christians, because I think in Luke it's not necessarily implying that the author is claiming that he talked with like the apostles. He's just saying that he's claiming that eyewitnesses handed down information from the
Yeah.
beginning to a group of Christians, and he's getting that from the group of
Yes.
Christians.
He's deliberately vague. And that's a good example. The whole preface is a good example where it looks and sounds like a preface to a history, but it's missing all of the things that would be in a real preface, or a real introductory section that discuss sources like this. A good example is Arian, right? Arian's a classic example of this, where he says, "Here are my sources. I'm going to name them. I'm going to describe them. I'm going to tell you why I'm using them instead of other sources. And then I'm going to tell you how I'm using those sources. So when they disagree, what am I going to do?" Right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he says, like, basically, if they disagree, I'll tell you they disagree and mention the disagreements. But if they agree, I'll just paraphrase what they'll agree on and move on, right? So that he doesn't always follow his method, but he does somewhat. And we do run into this where he'll say, well, then this is the version of the oracle at Siwa, but this other author had a slightly different version of events, and here's what he said. So Arian will do that, and that's good history in the sense. Like, Arian might not be the greatest historian ever. Like, I don't think there were any greatest historians ever. Like the ancient historians were very short on quality methodology, but then so were modern historians until like 1950, right? So 19th century historians are just crap. And so the ancient historians were a little bit better than 19th century historians.
Yeah.
But you look at good historians like Arian, he's doing that. But you notice what Luke does is he consciously avoids explaining who these written sources are that he's using. He avoids
Yes.
explaining why he's making the decisions that he does, because we know he disagrees with his sources. We know he changes and adds. So why is he picking one version over another? Why is he changing both versions? So he just says, I'm accurately preserving what they said, which he then goes on to demonstrate he absolutely is not doing. So he's basically lying. Like in that preface, he's just selling you a story about what he wants you to believe about his book, but he's avoiding all the information that you could use to catch him at not doing that, right? So by not naming Mark and Matthew, who are obviously the sources he's talking about, because he says written sources, he says, there were people who wrote before me. And we know he uses Mark and Matthew verbatim, like he quotes them verbatim and just slaps their text in, makes some changes and stuff like that. So, but he doesn't name them, because if he named them, then someone could go check and compare and say, wait a minute, right? Like they'd figure it out. So he's got to not say what books. So he has the plausible deniability, right? Like people are like, well, it wasn't Mark and Matthew are just bullshit texts. He had these other writings that were much more reliable. Trust us. Because he said, right? He says they're super reliable. I'm not going to tell you who they are or why they're reliable. But anyway, that's the scam that's being run with the text of Luke there.
Yeah, and I'm sure even if you're a Christian and believe that God inspired the text, which is, debatable, even then, you're going to have to accept the fact that probably Luke talked to one or two witnesses who weren't inspired and did actually contradict each other with accounts. And, the fact that Luke doesn't say, hey, I came across one witness who actually contradicted what another one said, and he doesn't talk about his methodology of how he arrived at,
Yep.
which person was saying the real story, which person got it
Yeah,
false.
and
That's a
he
little
also
telling.
specifically avoids ever saying that he talked to any witnesses, right? If you look especially at the Greek, but certainly if there's a decent translation of the text of the preface, he has made it sound like maybe he did, but he has very specifically avoided saying that. And that is very conspicuous. It's very conspicuous. He avoids saying that he talked to any witnesses. So he just couches it in a way that sounds like that's what he's saying, but it isn't what he's saying. So it's definitely one of those little slimy lies, right? Like he wants you to think that's what he said, but he wants plausible deniability in case you catch him. Right.
Yeah.
So that anyway, that's what's going on there. And there's no evidence that he had any eyewitnesses for anything, even for the stuff in the Book of Acts. It looks like he's just taking stories from the epistles of Paul. He might actually have like a complete set of Paul's epistles. This is something that we know that our Paul's epistles are pastiches of other letters. So we're missing whole letters. We're missing chunks of the letters that we have. So and some of the letters that we have are multiple letters in which pieces have been cut out and pasted together. So our
Mhm.
letters are not the original dossier. There's some edited version of them. And it's possible Luke had the unedited dossier, and so he had more information to pull from those letters. But we also know from the material that comes from the letters that we have that he didn't care about being accurate, right? He's actually specifically rewriting things. So he's telling the story completely differently than the sources actually show. So even if he had more material to work with than we do, he is in no way reliable in working with it.
Yeah, and another factor is when did this guy write? Because, you have the varying date ranges, like 65 AD to like, about 110 AD. And like, if he wrote like, in 90 AD and later, forget about it. So like
Yeah,
but if he wrote earlier, greater odds that I'll have better information. So, we have to debate the dates too. And, our dating is subjective in a sense. So we're just going to have
yeah.
to
I mean,
go with
there's
what we
there's
have.
evidence and good arguments and bad arguments in that debate. So the 60s, dating it to the 60s is just not possible. That's just apologetics, the desire to make it the 60s based on these sort of specious arguments that don't actually hold up. Luke clearly is relying on Matthew. Matthew is clearly relying on Mark, and Mark is clearly writing after the year 70. So Acts cannot be from the 60s. It's impossible. And any attempt to make it otherwise is just, rhetoric. It's just rhetoric and apologetics trying to make a thing the opposite of what it is, which, it's not, uh, it's not
Reasonable.
good sound argumentation. But when you look at the arguments for the dates being after the 90s or in the 90s or after, like the leading consensus now is like it's like roughly 115 plus minus 10. Right, is the view of Luke Acts. That usually gets placed there now by most of the scholars who are experts in it and who are not fundamentalist Christian apologists, right? So, because they need the date to be 60s and they need Luke to be a companion of Paul's, which is not true. And they need all these things to be true. And so they will argue them with complete confidence because that's what you do when you run a con. That's why they're called confidence men is you want to con people by acting like you're totally confident and it's absurd to think that they could be wrong, etc. That's apologetics. That's not legitimate scholarly argument.
Yeah, and yeah, with my interview with Robin Faith Walsh, she dated Luke to like, the 90s, like or like
Yeah, I think
105
that's the
AD.
earliest. The earliest it could be. It could be later, a decade or two later. It's possible.
I mean, and she's an associate professor at Miami University that had that, book the early Christian writings and like, the Greco-Roman, the influence of Greco-Roman,
Yeah,
whatever
really good book. I
civilization.
have a review, a review of it on my website. That's
Oh yeah.
entirely positive. Like I have a few disagreements with her, but they're not like major things. And so people who want to check that out on my blog again, look for Robin Faith Walsh, um, and you'll find search that and you'll find my article on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe the title's early Christian literature, and then there's like a subtitle that has to do with like the Greco-Roman influence or something like that. Yeah, it was a
Yeah,
good book, and she agreed with you. So if anyone's gonna accuse Carrie of being biased, you have an associate professor at Miami University,
yeah,
who's
and she's
going off
not
of
alone,
that too.
right? It's
Mhm.
important to note that she's not alone. There's a lot of professors at universities who agree with us. And I think the divide tends to fall on faith lines, as how devoted a fundamentalist evangelical are you, says more about what we can predict that you will claim than the evidence does, right? So,
Yeah. Alrighty. Thank you for answering that question. Alrighty. I'm gonna just go ahead to go to the. I'm gonna go ahead and go to the question of Papias, since we're kind of dealing with, the writings, like, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because he might possibly have alluded to those books, but I'll let you decide what he's talking about. So I'm gonna go with, first of all, I'm gonna go with who was Papias. Did you think that he existed, and do you think that he had reliable information about Jesus?
yeah, so there was definitely someone named Papias in the early to mid second century who wrote a book of some kind. But we don't have it, right? So we have quotations from it, and we have maybe paraphrases. We have paraphrases and quotations. So it's actually hard to reconstruct what exactly he said about anything, frankly, because we only get to see what someone else wants us to think about Papias. So Eusebius, for example, uses Papias. He wants us to have a particular opinion about Papias. Several, actually. He wants us to think various different things, all of which are dodgy. And so I don't think we can trust Eusebius to relay to us what we should actually believe about Papias. But definitely he wrote sometime, I mean, the usual consensus puts him somewhere around 130 plus or minus. And I think that's reasonable. He could be later. He could be 150 plus minus because we only start to hear of him towards the end. About 180 AD is when we start hearing references to him. Um, and that so his book seems to have been influential then, so it might have been as late as the 60s, right, the 160s, when he wrote. So we don't actually know, and no one gives us any reliable information on that. There's a lot of urban legends about Papias that are unbelievable. A lot of them seem like telephone games where something gets transformed in the retelling and then it becomes something else. So there's no, I do write about this a few times on my blog. You can look up the name Papias, Papias, and find a few times when I've talked about what Papias says in different ways. Now the other question is he reliable? No, completely 100% unreliable. Like nothing in Papias is believable. I mean, everything, every quotation from him is ridiculous. Like it's something that is ridiculous and obviously wrong. So there's nothing that we can actually trust from Papias, I think. The only thing we can get out of Papias is what the urban legends were at the time that he wrote. So I do think that I don't think Papias invented his stuff. I do think Papias is relaying urban legends that are floating around, rumors and urban legends and things, whatever someone said. He's relaying those things, but he's doing absolutely nothing, zero things to vet the truth of those claims. He's just writing them down. That sounds amazing. He's like one of those people that goes around and you go talk to someone and they're telling you all about how lizard people rule the earth. And you go, that's amazing. That's incredible. It's like Alex Jones, right? Like just believe whatever you tell him. And the next day he just goes, it's amazing. There's lizard people are ruling the earth. I heard. It's that kind of stuff. So Papias is like the Alex Jones of the 2nd century. And so you can't trust anything he says. And so that's a problem. But it does tell you about what Christians were believing or wanted you to believe at the time. So it gives you a sense of early to mid 2nd century Christian beliefs. So it's useful for that, but it's not useful at all for reconstructing anything that happened a century before.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to get into some of the specifics that, he states, or at least the words attributed to Papias, and get your take on it. I actually talked with Robert and Price about it. So yeah, and it was an interesting talk, so I think we'll have an interesting talk here as well. Alrighty, so what about Papias' statements about preferring the living word over books? What books could he have been talking about? And what about his statement concerning Jesus telling Judas how the millennial kingdom would be, since that statement isn't anywhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John?
Yeah, those are two different things, right? So remind me of the second thing. I'll talk about the first thing first. He doesn't actually say, right? So when he says, "I prefer the written word to book," or prefer the spoken word to books, he's stating a principle. So he's not saying, "Oh, there were these books that I should be reading, but I'm ignoring them." That's not what he means. What he means is like, well, I'm not going to do what a scholar does and go to the library and look stuff up. He says, I don't think that's reliable. I don't care what's in books. I don't, whatever. Which basically is saying he's not going to fact check anything, right? So, right. So, like the same way that Luke wrote Luke Acts, especially Acts, by going to the library and looking stuff up and putting it into his history. Nothing to do with Christianity, but things that would make his history seem plausible. He's like, oh, I'm going to name these people in here. I'm going to have them go to this town. And I can mention all of these, like who's running that town. And I could do all this stuff. I can put it in there and make it seem real. Luke went to the library to do all that. Papias is basically saying, I ain't going to the library. Fuck the library. And so he's not fact checking anything, right? He's not doing the reverse, like he's not reverse engineering Luke or anything like that. It's no. He just says, well, I don't know, like these really devout, believing Christians are saying stories they can't be. Like God would not let them lie, right? They just have so much faith, and I can just tell that you're totally telling the truth. And that it's that kind of like I just trust what people say. I believe rumors and urban legends and stuff. And it's very similar to the way like you have like MAGA now, where they just believe any rumor that goes around and they completely distrust anything that's written. Right. So like this, oh no, you can't read the Washington Post. You can't trust anything that's written. You got to like, put your ear to the ground, right? You got to go on the internet and find a forum and hear what the scuttlebutt is, right? That's how you learn. That's what Papias is doing. He's doing the same thing. It's like I trust urban legends because I'm not very smart and I don't have a decent methodology, but this is what I'm committing to. And that's Papias. So we don't know if there were any books that he had in mind when he said that. He's just dunking on books as a medium altogether. So,
I can just imagine you playing Papias in like a play and just being like, "Fuck this shit! I don't care about the truth. I just want to have blind faith. So I can
Yeah,
preach
that's not the
about
way he would say it.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's not the way he would say it. He would say it the other way around. He would say only what comes by faith is true. Right. So if there's a believing Christian who's just a great guy and he clearly has the power of Christ in him, then whatever he says is true. That's what he means. Right? So it's not that he doesn't care what's true. It's just he has a completely wrong idea about how you're going to determine what is true. And that's what we've got with Papias.
Yeah, just a quick commentary on this. I think you've heard of this before. William Lane Craig was like, even if a Christian is debating against an atheist or a non-believer who makes a good argument against the Christian, better, and the Christian's like, I don't have a good way to resolve this issue. Craig was like, well, the Christian can just rely on the witness of the Spirit, and that will count as if, he had good evidence. The
Yeah.
Christian had good evidence when he did it. I'm like, but anyone from, like a Muslim
Yeah.
could do
Yeah.
that, and what would Craig think of that? So I mean, that just doesn't work.
Yeah, I have a chapter. Well, I talk about this in Not the Impossible Faith, so it's in my book. But I also talk about it in my on my blog. So you can look up what did I call it? Intellectual. Let's see. Wow, doggone it. Let me find that. Anti-intellectualism. That's what it is. Early Christian anti-intellectualism. I think if you just look for here, I'll get the title correct. Yeah, a primer on Christian anti-intellectualism. That I go into detail about what they're actually telling us were their methodologies, and it's very similar to what you just described, where the Holy Spirit is more reliable than anything else. If a Christian can perform a miracle, aka psychosomatically do a faith healing act convincingly, then they can't lie, right? It's these kinds of ridiculous claims that they go on. And like similar things like anything that disagrees with our dogma has to be false. But if it agrees with our dogma, it's probably true, like a completely backwards methodology. So they actually explicitly say these things. So you can look at, and they not only say them, but you can watch them do it. Like when you're reading texts like Justin Martyr and Tertullian and stuff like that, you can see them do it on the page. And then sometimes they'll just outright tell you what they're doing. And the methodologies are bonkers and completely unreliable, but they're very similar. Like these are the same methodologies that have been used to sustain religion for thousands of years. That's why you still see someone like William Lane Craig, who really ought to know better, advocating exactly that kind of bankrupt epistemology, right there, right? Like this is modern era.
Gotcha. Alrighty, and then to conclude on Papias, what about Papias' statement, or at least the words attributed to Papias, about Jesus telling Judas about how the millennial kingdom would be, since that statement's not reported in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John?
Yeah, so we have a few weird statements from Papias that don't come from the existing Gospels. One of them that I think is illustrative is this extremely insane legend about Judas's death. It is the most ridiculous Nightmare on Elm Street storyline that you'll ever hear, and it's just full of the ridiculous. Like it is exactly like the kind of ridiculous urban legend that you would hear today, and you go, "That's impossible. That never happened." It's like the Russians were digging a mine and they opened up the gateway to hell and they heard screaming.
Oh,
It's like that never happened, right?
yeah, check Snopes on
Like
that.
yeah, NASA ran a calculation and figured out that the Earth actually stopped 3,000 years ago, matching the story in the Old Testament. No, it's totally made up. So we get these kind of absurd storylines in Papias, and the one with Judas is where his body swelled to the size so large that even a wagon couldn't pass him on a road, and then he was full of worms, and then eventually he exploded. And that was the end of Judas, right? And it's like this never happened, right? And it's not in the Gospels either, obviously. But you can see if you analyze it, you can see how it is a telephone game series of exaggerations that follows what happens in the Gospels. So in the Gospels, it's Judas just hangs himself. And then in Luke takes that story in Acts, and now Judas falls and blows up. His organs pop out or whatever. So it must have been a really far distance between where he hanged himself and where he fell. But anyway, that's the idea. So it's at least within the realm of something that could happen. But it's clear that Luke is exaggerating. He's embellishing the story. He's making it sound more fabulous and disgusting and horrible, whoa, terrible fate for Judas, when really it was just he hung himself. And even that was made up, right? So there was no Judas, etc. It's all a myth. But But then you get like you can see exaggerations of, oh, his organs popped out. Oh, maybe he grew to the size of a wagon trail and exploded. And the idea of worms, like there's a legend of one of the Herods had worms and died of it. He didn't explode, but it was just ordinary like parasitic disease. But you can see how someone is taking like these stories of what are the horrible ways some horrible person could die and just stacking them on top. Because there's more in the description of Papias. It's like he even mentions that I think he couldn't find his eyes. Like he's swollen so much that you need a medical instrument to like open and see his eyes. Right? Like it's just, you can just see like a drunk uncle at a Thanksgiving party just adding elaboration on elaboration. It's ridiculous, right? So this is what Papias says it with a straight face. He's like, this is what I heard. It's got to be true, right? So that illuminates this other one. So you're talking about where Jesus tells the disciples. I think his disciples ask, "What's it going to be like in the second world, or the new world that God creates after He's destroyed everything?" And he says, "Oh." According to Papias, he says, "Oh, well, there will be these giant grapevines with thousands of grapes on them, the size of houses." And Judas is like, "No way!" And then Jesus goes, "Yes, way." And that's the story. Right? Jesus says, like, when you get there, you'll see. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but no, it's like that. The conversation is as dumb as that, is what's depicted. And that never happened. That conversation never happened. Someone made it up. And so the question is, like, where do they get? So like with Papias' ridiculous Judas story, we can see the trajectory. We can figure out where this is coming from, how it evolved into that stupid story. So where did the great giant grapes come from? That actually comes from existing Jewish literature. That was a thing. So we have, I think Enoch and Baruch, second Baruch at least, and they specifically mention this. These are Jewish texts, or started as Jewish texts, and they mention this giant grapes, the huge thousands of grape clusters of the size of a house or whatever. Maybe not specifically saying the size of a house, but similar, right? Saying that there's the giant fruit there is going to be amazing and awesome. Just wait, and then that creeps into other Christian texts. So we have like the Apocalypse of Paul, for example. We have a later Coptic text, the Encomium on St. John by John Chrysostom. We have other things too. So we have other Christian literature where this happens, where Jesus, there's one version where Jesus he takes the disciples on a tour of the third heaven. So he actually takes them there and shows them the giant grapes and all of that, because they're supposed to be in the third heaven, because that's where the Garden of Eden is. So that's where all the fabulous, amazing fruit is. And so that's where we're going to go live, I guess, according to that tradition. And there's different traditions, but that one. So anyway, Papias has gotten some sort of telephone gamed version of this story that got inserted into the mouth of Jesus, even though it originated in Jewish teachings. And then, get these sort of silly stories and stuff. And then Papias relates it. And it's a typical story that's made up, because you have the stupid skeptic, you have Judas pulling the Scully, and of course everybody hates Judas. Judas is bad, so you already know that skepticism is bad. So don't question the giant grapes. You'll end up like Judas. And then Jesus' brilliant response is, "Oh, you'll see." It's like that. No, Jesus never said that. That never happened. But you can see the trajectory, right? So Papias is just reacting to these urban legends that grew up in his time.
Yeah, I believe even Eusebius in one of his writings says that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Papias, his impression of Papias
Yeah.
was that he was a man of very little intelligence.
Yeah, even Eusebius, who wants to rely on Papias, can't bring himself to call him reliable. Even Eusebius would say, he's not the
Mhm.
brightest bulb. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's true. That's in Eusebius. He does say that.
Alrighty, sounds good. Alrighty, going into our next question. Me and Robert and Price actually had a good talk about this. So why was the Transfiguration account included in some of the Gospels and in Second Peter? Robert and Price informed me that there very well might have been some rabbis complaining to Christ and the apostles that Elijah must come before the Messiah, and they didn't accept the far-stretched he was John the Baptist. So the gospel writers invented Elijah appearing in front of Christ to prove Elijah did come on earth again before the Messiah. What do you say about that theory?
I don't buy that theory. I think that cannot explain the text. However, the hypothesis is correct insofar as we see this in Justin Martyr, right? So Justin Martyr, that he invents a Jew that he's arguing with in dialogue with Trypho, and so he's putting the into the mouth of what he thinks the Jews are arguing. And so one of the arguments is, but Elijah has to come first. And so Justin says, but he did. John the Baptist, John the Baptist, he was Elijah. And that's what he says. Now, where does Justin get that idea? Well, the Gospel of Mark, because Gospel of Mark practically outright says that. Like in the beginning, it describes John the Baptist using terminology that describes Elijah. They have Jesus explicitly say that Elijah has already come. So in the transfiguration they're talking about, right? They're coming down the mountain after that happened, and Jesus says Elijah already came, and they already did everything to them that they wanted, meaning he's dead, meaning it was John the Baptist, right? So Mark is selling the idea that John the Baptist was Elijah. Now, Elijah showing up on the mountain doesn't help with that storyline, right? Because if Elijah's dead, who are you talking to? You're talking to Elijah's ghost. So that doesn't help you, right? So you need the rest of the narrative. So do you need why have Elijah appear? You don't need it because you already have Jesus saying John the Baptist was Elijah. That Mark opened his book with obviously John the Baptist being depicted as Elijah, and so that's covered. So that argument is covered already. So why add the transfiguration? It doesn't do anything as far as advancing that narrative. And that's where we look at what other scholars have speculated and said. The most common point that's made about this is that it replicates what are called mountain epiphanies, which are very common in Jewish literature. We have one for Moses, we have one for Elijah in the Bible, which is why Moses and Elijah show up, right? So the idea is Jesus is there, Moses and Elijah, you're on a mountain already, cue. Moses and Elijah show up, cue. And then Jesus gets radiant, just like Moses did, cue. So the whole point of this is to remind you, oh, Moses, Elijah, remember what happened to them? God, visited them on a mountain and delivered whatever wisdom. And so now Jesus is there. He's getting the glowing light in face and body or whatever, just like Moses. And then what's the wisdom that God now imparts? Before the witness, the dual witness, because two witnesses are really important in Jewish courts. Dual witness of Moses and Elijah are brought down from heaven just to be witnesses to testify to the fact that God says, you are my son, yada, yada, right? So it's an obvious narrative just meant to sell Jesus as the Messiah. Let's have him go up a mountain. Let's have him glow like Moses. Let's have Moses and Elijah show up to cue everybody as to what we're talking about. Have God then declare Jesus his son, etc. It's all a myth narrative meant for that purpose, right? And that's the commonest view. That's what most scholars say is the case. I think it's a reasonable discussion, a reasonable theory. And I think it gets support from some other things. So in my book on the historicity of Jesus, I point out that there is a sort of a chiastic structure to Mark. And when you look at that chiastic structure, you see there's a parallel story also on a mountain. And that's when Jesus goes up the mountain on Mark 3. The transfiguration is Mark 9. And in Mark 3, Jesus goes up the mountain, and that's when he appoints his disciples and starts the movement, right? And the disciples get named and stuff. And he basically picks his right-hand men, too. So he's got James, John, and Peter are his trips, right? Those are his top three guys. And so then you get to the transfiguration, and who shows up? Jesus, James, Peter, and Paul, or James, Peter, and John. And then there's a triptych of Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. So you have disciples, prophets staring at each other, right? And so that it's kind of the message is that to sell this, it helps sell this idea that Jesus is the Messiah, proclaimed by God, endorsed by Moses and Elijah, and all of that. There's also elements, I know there's some analysis of this by Dennis MacDonald, in Homeric epics in the Gospel, according to Mark. And he shows, especially so he has two sections where he talks about this in the book. The first section is less convincing. The second section is more convincing, but there's good material in both. And the structure, obviously, of the story comes from the Jewish Epiphany literature, right? So it's the stories about Moses, stories about Elijah. That's where they're getting. There's a lot of these other Epiphany things. A lot of elements are coming in from the Jewish literature. But there's also elements that have been introduced that don't come from that. And those elements do appear to come from the Odyssey. because there's a similar epiphany scene. It's kind of reversed, where Odysseus has been magically turned into some to look like someone else, and his son mistakes him for a god, and Odysseus has to argue with him and convince him that he's not a god. But there's a lot of elements there that are similar. So like having the fabulous clothes, like amazing clothes, that Jesus' clothes glow. So the idea of clothes glowing might come from the emulation of the Odyssey, for instance. It's not that Odysseus's clothes glowed. It's just that they were somehow special, right? They changed, the clothes changed as part of the epiphany, whatever. So there's a lot of these like little elements that might trace back to that, but I think those are just color. I think ultimately the story structure comes from the Jewish literature, and that's what's going on there. And it is meant to sell Jesus as the chosen one of God. It's like the climax of the story, and it's confirming this is the guy. Everything after that is epilogue, right? So anyway, that's my take on it.
Alrighty, sounds good. And then for our last question, what'd you think of the John Dominic Crossan interview that I did, where I asked Crossan about, the new perspective of Paul movement, brought about in popularity by N.T. Wright, and then he comments on like why he thinks, Paul's more of an important subject matter in today's time. And then he ends up saying that, he says, with all due respect to Tom Wright, his view on Acts is, good writing, but it's purely for fiction. He was like trying to get across, like, don't imply that, Acts describes, I guess it has like historical inaccuracies or something like that.
Yeah,
And he like
right.
really got on him. So yeah, what do you think about that take? What was that all about?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to warn the audience of my bias. I think N.T. Wright is a terrible historian. He's really bad at it, and he does not deserve the honor and respect that he gets for this. He's just really bad at it. And I give it some examples you can find on my blog. There's a link on my blog called Writings, and in Writings you can go into Jesus studies, and in Jesus studies I have an FAQ, on the resurrection, where I interact with a lot of the things that N.T. Wright has said that are completely wrong. I've also got I have an article. I think it's why N.T. Wright is wrong. Let's see, and let me make sure I get it right. N.T. Wright. I have an article on my blog too that you can go hunt down. It might even come and link to some of the others. Yeah, N.T. Wright demonstrates the bankruptcy of Christian apologetics in under 9 minutes. That's the title of my article. But what I do there is what I also do in Not the Impossible Faith. There's several other examples in NIF. Also in the Empty Tomb, some of my articles there. I catch him making a lot of basic mistakes that he shouldn't be making. And they're the kinds of things that you an amateur would make because you don't know to check things. One of the examples I give in my FAQ is that N.T. Wright bases a lot of his arguments on the Principia of Origen, the church father Origen, his 3rd century writer. There's this First Principles that he wrote, this book. And N.T. Wright just makes all these arguments from that. The problem is that he's using passages that are from the corrupted Latin translation of Rufinus that even Jerome himself denounced as a completely fraudulent translation, right? So, and what happened is Origen was declared a heretic, but people loved his First Principles. So Frontinus, wait a minute, I might be getting the name wrong now that I'm thinking about it. I can't remember the name of the guy. It starts with an F, I think. But anyway, neither here nor there. Point being is that this guy, this Latin author, rewrote the entirety of the Principia to be orthodox. So he took out all the heretical things and rewrote, basically made Origen say the exact opposite of what he said. And Jerome says, look, you can't do that to the guy, right? Like, let's be honest about the text. And we actually have letters where Jerome's like bitching about this. Like, I just can't accept this bogus translation because it's trying to make things go away that were there and things like that. And N.T. Wright doesn't know this because he didn't check, right? He didn't check to see, like, should I be relying on this text? What text is this, right? Why is it in Latin when Origen wrote in Greek? Like he should have done that so that he knew that the text wasn't reliable. And the thing is Wright is using it ironically for points that the author of the forged, the fraudulent translation wanted him to think. So Wright is allowing himself to be duped by a propagandist who's trying to eclipse the actual teachings of Origen, the exact opposite of what Wright is supposed to be doing, right? So that's just one example. You could list example. The one about the bankrupt bankrupt methods is about a different thing. There's tons of mistakes like this. Like it's just I don't know why he's a historian, why people think he's a good historian. He's not. And then what Crossan said, I also agree with, which is where Wright does this, where he cherry picks verses like any Christian apologist does. Cherry picks verses and then creates a just so story. Like he confidently asserts a story about how this text came to be and what it signifies and stuff, and says, see, therefore we have evidence for whatever. And that's apologetics. It's not legitimate methodology. And what Crossan is saying is like, you can't do that. You've got to actually sit down. And I think he says this almost verbatim. Like I'm paraphrasing pretty closely here. He says, you got to sit down. You got to read Paul all the way through. You can't cherry pick verses out of context. You just got to read the whole thing, read all the letters of Paul, then read Acts, read the whole thing. And only then are you going to be prepared to actually understand what's going on here. And when you do, you'll notice right away that Acts is making up tons of stuff. It's deliberately contradicting Paul. It's not just accidentally doing so. It's deliberately misinforming us about Paul. And so once you understand that, then you can't make the kinds of arguments that N.T. Wright is making. They're naive and they're in service to ideological beliefs. They're not in service to trying to determine what actually happened. So he's not acting like a historian. He's pretending to be a historian, but really acting like a Christian apologist. And that's,
Like Luke.
Crossan said that in a much more polite way than I just did. But he's right about that. And also what Crossan said that Acts is fiction. Obviously, as I just mentioned before, I agree. I think it's complete fiction. It has kernels of history, almost none of which are none of which are related to Jesus, almost none of which are related to Christians. Some of them might be. He might have some information about Christianity that we've lost the records of, but it's hard to figure out which things those are because we've lost the texts and things like that. But anyway, I talk about this in my blog article on Acts as fake history. And in terms of like what history could be in Acts and how we might find it, I talk about that on the Historicity of Jesus. On chapter 9 is all about Acts, where there are things that are weird in Acts, and they're weird in a way that they could only be there if they were based on some sort of source material that we don't have. But anyway, go into how you would figure that out and things like that there.
Sweet, yeah. And then after the interview with Crossan, I actually messaged NT Wright. I was like, hey, John Dominic Crossan thinks you're an idiot. And I was like, he got mad at you for passing off, fiction as fact in regards to how Paul's portrayed in Acts, and I guess some other things in Acts too. And I was like, I gave him the opportunity to sit down on my podcast and give a refutation to Crossan. So I give you, as much time as he needs or whatever. And then NT Wright was like, I don't have time in my schedule to do any podcasts, and then just said warm blessings. I'm like, I don't know, dude.
That's fair.
As a John Dominic Crossan.
But you gave him a shot though. That's fair.
Yeah. I gave him a shot. He just didn't feel like it. And if I was like, hey, Carrier also has some problem with it, increase the cross, and he's just gonna be like, I'm too busy, so I'm not. What's the point? I don't think when people say they're too busy, 90% of the time they're not too busy. Either it means they're afraid or they're not getting paid enough. That's what too busy means.
Well, I'm almost always too busy for things, but so I actually have a little more respect for that excuse. But what I would expect, well, you're right, I am here. But I would expect though is for him to have something in the pipe and say like, oh, I've already responded to that here, or he would say, oh, I'm interested in responding to that, like give me the URL and stuff. So maybe I'll write a little bit about it and you could reference
send him the
link,
like
that kind of. That's there are things that I would just dismiss. But someone like Crossan's like a major scholar, so I wouldn't just dismiss something that he said about my work. I would say, oh, I got to respond to this if it warrants a response, right? That kind of thing.
I was going to say in my second interview with Crossan, I called him a legend because he's one of the co-chairs of the Jesus Seminar. He's like, oh, I'm glad to be back. I didn't know I was a legend. And I was like, of course you're a legend. I think you might have more credentials than N.T. Wright.
Actually, that's true. Right. So anyway, I've got to get back to my busy life, my work, actually. So it's been good questions, and glad to have the opportunity to bring them up.
Yep, and I'll send you the link to this as soon as it's done being uploaded. All right. Thank you, Dr. Carrier, for being on, and have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, you too. Take it easy.